ran until 1914. And in the long 19th century, there was a lot that was said about God, about the holiness of God, about the universality of God. Lots of very interesting things were said about God through the 19th century and all the way up until 1914. It's a very great pleasure to be recording these recollections of coming to Winscombe and talking about God, the church and worship, and how that was affected by the First World War. I'm working on the assumption that the 19th century lasted until 1914. And in that long run of the 19th century, all the way up to the First World War, lots of interesting things were said about God, about the holiness of God, about the universality of God, God connecting with everybody. All sorts of very interesting things were said about God. But in the trenches of the First World War, those who were sensitive pastors and theologians, often the chaplains, found that they'd come into the trenches, come into that piece of work, ministering in the hardest of all circumstances. They'd come into that not quite prepared, and also they were beginning to see something new about God that had not been seen perhaps in the 19th century. And that was the suffering of God. Through the 19th century, as I've said, some very interesting things were discovered and reaffirmed about God. But God seemed rather remote. God seemed rather distant. And God, when God was described, seemed holy and other, away from people. And then in the First World War, sensitive pastors and chaplains and theologians began to think, where is God in this mire and this mess and this death? So much death, so much suffering and pain and darkness. Where is God? Asked the very sensitive priests who were the theologians and the chaplains. And the answer that they bravely came up with was that God suffers. God suffers with us and in us. Now that's something that's not new in the Christian tradition. It had been around and affirmed in the earlier centuries. And of course it has been affirmed for a long time that Christ suffered on the cross. But gradually that teaching had been either forgotten or smoothed, so that people said, oh well, Christ on the cross only suffers as a human being. He doesn't suffer as God. In the trenches of the First World War, the chaplains felt that something bolder needed to be said, because where was God in all this catastrophe? And the answer they came up with was that God is right in the middle of it. God is right there, engaged in the suffering, not detached, and yes, away in one aspect, but very close in another aspect. One particular chaplain comes to mind, a man called Timothy Rees, a very sensitive man, a very devout and godly man, a chaplain who pondered these things deeply and then went on to be a monk in the Church of England and a bishop in South Wales. He was a bishop there during the time of the Great Depression in the 1920s and 30s, and he saw huge numbers of men just turned out into unemployment. And he felt he saw the same thing again. He'd seen God suffering in the trenches, and now he was seeing God suffering in the valleys. And he wrote a hymn, which is still in the hymn book. It's sung quite often, God is love. And at one point that hymn says, and when human hearts are breaking under sorrow's iron rod, then they find that self-same aching deep within the heart of God. Before the entry into the catastrophe of the First World War, through the 19th century, that would not have been said. It could not have been said. But after it had been said, then when it comes to the death camps of Nazi Germany, when it comes to the atrocities in other parts of the world. Our eyes have been opened so that we can say that God suffers with us and in us. God is stronger than the suffering, God is bigger than the suffering, but God is in us and with us as we suffer and will lead us on, as he did in the trenches of the First World War and as he did in the valleys of the Great Depression, because the suffering God gives hope. The chaplains and the pastors of the First World War learned something about the suffering of God, which was new, revolutionary and fresh, and opened insights that have lasted all the way through the 20th century and into the 21st century. They also discovered how very far away from so many of the soldiers in the trenches they actually were. There'd been lots of church building, there'd been lots of creating of parishes. The 19th century in England was a hugely productive time for the Church of England. Schools, hospitals, convents, parish churches, all manner of endeavour right across the country, and especially in the new industrial areas. But for all that building and for all that endeavour, when it got to the point of the chaplains meeting the soldiers, the ordinary, working, dying soldiers, they discovered how far away they were and how far the church had been from these people's experience up to that point. And they were shamed and they were challenged as well. And in those moments, in the trenches, those chaplains, those pastors felt a wonderful close connection with so many people. And after the First World War, they were determined to try and keep that closeness of connection. And that continued. There were heroic efforts through the 20th century to keep the church and the people as close as possible. There were more efforts to build more churches. There was more building of schools. There was also a desire to bring people into the ordained ministry of the Church of England who might have been refused in other circumstances, people whose education perhaps wasn't very rich or strong, but they were drawn into theological colleges and into new institutions that gave the possibility of being ordained to people who were not perhaps, in inverted commas, educated and middle class. And so the Church of England's ministry diversified through the 20th century with a continuing zeal to keep things close, because that's what the chaplains had discovered in the First World War. And there were efforts such as workplace chaplaincies. Workplace chaplaincies developed through the 20th century were very important in places like Sheffield, where people were in steel enterprise and coal enterprise, and chaplains went right into things there and continue to do so in a way that would have been unimaginable without those First World War chaplains coming out of the trenches and saying to the church, just as we have been close in the trenches of the First World War, so we must continue to be close hereafter. And the Church of England's ministry changed and was reshaped with that particular zeal in mind. If it hadn't been for those chaplains and for the First World War experience, that would not have happened. My third reflection is on worship and how that was changed by the First World War. The chaplains arrived in the trenches with the working men, the soldiers, and found that the service that they had to use, the Book of Common Prayer's order for Holy Communion, was something just inflexible and so very difficult to use in the trenches. It felt a million miles away from people's actual lived experience. So there was a zeal as soon as these chaplains came out of the trenches and when the war was finished to make orders of service that were much more close to people's experience, that in some sense were simpler and more accessible. And through the 20th century, there has been a long effort on behalf of the Church of England and other traditions to make acts of worship simpler, yes, dignified, but simpler and more immediate, so that people can come as close to God as they can and not feel alienated by a form of language that it is at a huge distance. So the order of service that many people will be using in Winscombe or in any other parish in the 20th century, with its fresh language and its fresh approach, actually comes straight from the trenches of the First World War, in a sense. The zeal for change made the orders of service that we use today.